I'd like to begin by asking you if you could give us your name, when and where you were born, and the names of your parents.
My name is Robert Paul Frank. I was born March 16, 1944 in Newport News, Virginia. My parents' names were Harry Frank and Lil Frank. My mother was born in Russia, in Latvia, and my father was born in Newport News.
So tell me a little bit about the background of your parents. You said that your mother was born in Russia. Do you know when she was born?
She was born in 1906 or 7, I think.
Mm-hmm. And
she came to this country with her mother and 4 or 5 other siblings. She wasn't more than a couple years old. My family is Jewish, as am I. And in Tsar's Russia, I think the draft age was something like 14 or 15. And for a Jewish young man, when you got drafted, you had to give up your religion, and you were probably in the army forever. So my grandfather came over a year and a half before with the oldest 2 children. One was my uncle and one was my aunt. And while I never heard specifically, I gathered that they came over so that my oldest uncle would avoid the draft. And then about a year and a half later, my grandmother came over with 4 or 5 the other remaining children. And it's just remarkable how you can have little children and undergo such a journey when they probably had never been out of the little town that they lived in.
do you know what town they lived in?
Yes. It's called Jacobstown, Jakobstadt, Yakobstadt, and it's in Latvia.
And what were your grandparents' names?
My maternal grandparents, Samuel Morwitz, Morewitz, and Rachel Morwitz.
And so when they came to this country, I assume that they came aboard a ship.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know where they landed here in America?
They, I'm not sure. Probably Ellis Island.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the Jews from Eastern Europe either came to Ellis Island or Baltimore.
And so your mother arrived here in this country, and where did they settle?
In Newport News.
Why in Newport News?
Because they had family here already. My grandfather had a brother, so they came here. In fact, what's interesting is that I collect old postcards, and I have a postcard of the house that they lived in when they came over to this country, and it was called Hell's Half Acre, which was down by the docks in Newport News, and they lived above a bar.
Did anyone work at the Newport News shipyard?
No. Later I had an uncle uncle by marriage, but none of them did. My grandfather was a shoemaker, and they were poor people, but they had a lot of, they were very religious Jewish people, and they certainly were committed to providing for their children, and they worked hard to do so.
Did your grandparents, how many children did your grandparents have?
I'd have to count, but probably 8
Mm-hmm.
or so.
And where did your mother fall in the list of?
Kind of in the middle.
Okay. And so your mother grew up in Newport News. What about your father? Tell me a little bit about him.
My father was born in Newport News. His parents met. She had a relative in Newport News. My father was already here, and so she came down to Newport News to meet the relative, to visit with the relative, and ultimately my grandparents were married. They were married in Baltimore about 1902 and 1903. And he was in the dry cleaning business. And he had that business until he died in his mid-40s. And the family maintained that dry cleaning business. And in fact, my father was in that business initially, and then ultimately had his own business, and he repaired and sold dry cleaning equipment. And he did that till he died.
Now, what were your paternal grandparents' names?
Nettie, Nettie, and Joseph Frank. What's interesting is I don't think their name was Frank in Europe, or his name was Frank in Europe, but I'm not sure. My wife and I have done some genealogical work, and there's a city director, a Newport News city directory about 1906 or 07 that lists his name as Frankel, Frankel, but after that it was Frank all the way. So I'm not sure whether that was a typo or whether that was in fact his name, but we're reasonably sure it wasn't Frank in Europe. And he came from I'm not sure, maybe Hungary. No, sorry, Romania. He was from Romania. And my paternal grandmother was from Poland. She always said the family lore is that she was from Austria. But in terms of European history, Poland was controlled by Germany, Russia, and I have to think for a minute, and Austria. But she apparently lived in the Austrian-controlled area of Poland, but technically she was from Poland, but she always said she was from Austria.
Mm-hmm. And do you know when your paternal grandparents came into the country? Or about when?
I think he came over about 1890 something, and I think she came 1880 something. She came over with a sister.
Mm-hmm.
There was already, they already had some brothers in Baltimore, so when they came over, they lived with the brothers in Baltimore.
And so your paternal grandparents, where did they live in Newport News?
They lived on 26th Street in downtown Newport News.
Mm-hmm.
And my maternal grandparents lived on 20, I might have it backwards. One lived on 26 and one lived on 27, so they were neighbors. And my father and my mother knew each other because they were a block apart, and ultimately they got married in 1941.
Do you know if your parents had thought years prior to getting married that they might get married, or did something special happen?
No, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
So they were married on the eve of the Second World War. Did your father get drafted into the military?
No, he was too old.
Okay.
But what he did, fascinating story, is that neighborhoods throughout the country were organized for civil defense purposes, and I think he was the fire marshal for the block.
Okay. And so you grew up, of course you were born near the end of the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
You grew up in this same neighborhood that your parents grew up in, or did they move?
I was over town. We grew up at 700 block of 30th Street, and then we moved about 1956 to the 900 block of 13th Street in Stewart Gardens, Christopher Shores area.
So tell me about life growing up in Newport News as a little boy in elementary school? Where did you go to school?
I went to elementary school about a block from my house, so we would walk to school. And then I went to Walter Reed, which is on Wickham Avenue, about 25th Street. Then went to Newport News High School in the 7th grade. Graduated in 1961. Then went to the University of Virginia and graduated undergraduate school in 65 and law school in 68.
So when you were growing up in Newport News, tell me what you enjoyed doing as a child.
Well, I enjoyed playing basketball. I enjoyed playing baseball. I had wonderful friends. It was a wonderful neighborhood. It was safe. Not a lot of pressure. Worked hard. I was a good student. But it was just wonderful, a wonderful neighborhood. We never locked our doors. We never had keys to the house because it wasn't necessary. Safe place to live, but because of my parents, it was a very nurturing existence. Neither one of my parents ever graduated high school, but they knew it was important to have a good education, and they always pushed us. My brother went to Virginia undergraduate and Virginia Law School, and we had a very successful college and law school career. He practices law in Newport News. He was mayor of Newport News for 12 years. And
what years do you remember?
Well, he didn't run for re-election 4 years ago, so you'd have to do the math backwards.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then before that, he was vice mayor. He had been, I think, on city council since 1986.
Mm-hmm.
So for two poor boys from Newport News, I think we've done well.
Now, tell me, just going back a bit to your schooling, your early schooling, did you have a favorite subject?
I've always liked history, and I still do.
And what about when you were in high school? Did you have any favorite history teachers or teachers in other subjects?
Well, I had a number of favorite teachers. I had a biology teacher that I really liked. In fact, when I went on the bench, she wrote me a nice note, which was really nice to receive.
Who was that biology teacher?
Her name was Frances Nettles, Nettles. And in college, I majored in speech and drama, and had a professor, John Graham, who I really admired, and who I think, if I had to choose one person as a mentor, I think it would be him.
Why is that?
Because he was very encouraging. He was very supportive. I was on the debate team. He was the coach. He was my advisor, and he was just a role model. Very decent, honest man, straightforward, and he died about 2 or 3 years ago, and I regret that I never saw him again after I graduated undergraduate school.
Were there any things in particular that you remember him saying to you?
No.
Now, what about your religious life growing up in Newport News? You had indicated that your grandparents were very devout Jews, and so did your family go to synagogue? Did they?
We went to synagogue on a regular basis. We celebrated all the holidays. We observed the rules of keeping kosher at home. We always had a Friday night Sabbath dinner. So we weren't observant in a real technical sense, but Judaism played a major role in our household and in our lives.
What synagogue did you attend?
Adath Jeshurun, Adathjeshurun, which is still in existence.
Now, was there a large Jewish community in Newport News?
I don't know about large, but it was a very active community. There was a whole group of Jewish organizations that everybody was involved in. There was a Jewish community center that was where we played basketball, where we went to Hebrew school. Very active Jewish community.
And did the community have any interaction with other Jewish communities in the region?
I don't think there was a lack of it, but I think that it was a pretty self-contained community.
Mm-hmm. And what about your travels? When you were growing up, did your parents take you and your family anywhere? Or?
Yeah, we didn't have any money, so it wasn't that we took cruises or went to Europe, but we had family in D.C., and we would visit them in D.C., and we stayed there at their house. In the summer, we would determine when we would go up there based on when the Yankees played the Washington Senators. So we always used to go to see baseball games. We'd also try to coordinate this when the Boston Red Sox came to town. I saw Ted Williams. I saw Yogi Berra, Mickey Mantle. So those were some great childhood memories.
Did you all drive up there, or
Yes.
did you take the train?
No, we drove, but earlier we would catch the ferry from Old Point Comfort, and it was an overnight cruise up to D.C.,
Huh.
which was really fun.
Yeah. Now, you did mention your brother. Did you have any other siblings?
None.
And when was your brother born?
He was born in Newport News on November of 1942.
So he was the older brother.
Right.
Is he the one who motivated you to apply to UVA?
Yes, he was there already.
Is that why you decided you wanted to go there?
I think pretty much.
And so tell me about your experiences at UVA. It's a huge environment, and you're coming
Well,
from
it
a small
wasn't that
town.
big a school. It wasn't as big a school then. We would wear coats and ties every place, on weekends, to school, to class. It was a different environment then, but much smaller. We went to the movies, we went to the football games, went to all the sporting events. My second year, moved into the fraternity house, which was probably a mistake.
Why do you say that?
Well, I made Dean's List my first 2 semesters of my first year. And when I moved into the fraternity house, I didn't do particularly well because there were so many distractions and I didn't have the discipline that I should have. You know, I went to school when I was 17 years old. So I didn't do well then. So the third year, I took some extra classes to make up for those grades. And I took 18 hours and got A's in every class. So it got my attention.
What fraternity was it that you joined?
A.E. Pi.
And what got you interested in joining that particular fraternity?
Well, my brother was in it already.
So did the two of you live in the same frat house?
No, but we later lived in an apartment together.
And now, what did you major in college?
Speech and drama.
And what got you interested in majoring in that?
Basically, the professor, John Graham. In those days, I don't know what it is today, but you don't declare a major until your third year, or in your third year you have a major, but the first 2 years you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took a class or two in my first 2 years, and I really got to like him, got to be friendly, and I thought that was a good way to go.
Do you remember your first year dorm?
Mm-hmm.
Where was it?
I'll have to think of it, but I mean, I remember it, and I don't know whether it was Emmett. No, Kent.
Uh-huh.
It was Kent.
Uh-huh.
And I had a roommate from South Carolina who is still one of my dearest friends today. He practices law in Alexandria.
What is his name?
Herb Rosenblum, Rosenblum.
Mm.
And when I have court in Alexandria, we always get together. And he's still my dear friend after 50 plus years.
And at what point did you decide law was what you wanted?
It was almost a default. What I really wanted to do was teach at college level. And my John Graham said that he could get me some money, and I thought about it, but then I decided that I ought to go to law school. And primarily my brother was already there, and we had talked about it, and I knew what to expect. I had no idea at that time that I would ultimately be a judge on the Virginia Court of Appeals.
What then attracted you more to law than to teaching?
I'm not sure, other than that's what my brother was doing. I still like to teach, and I've taught as an adjunct at William and Mary Law School, but I still enjoy that. And all through the years I've had interns or externs from William and Mary Law School in my chambers, and you know, I interact with them and we discuss cases. So I'm always trying to impart some of my wisdom on these law students.
Well, it sounds as if your brother has had a tremendous impact on your life. So tell me a little bit about him. What is your favorite memory of your brother?
Oh, there are just so many that, you know, again, we didn't have a lot of money, but we shared the same bedroom. And we've shared all of our life experiences together. And, you know, I still respect him. And he's still, other than my wife, he's still my best friend.
And growing up, there was no sibling rivalry?
None. None. And today, there's no sibling rivalry because each of us have done extremely well in our own field. And he was a wonderful mayor and did a tremendous amount of good for the city.
What did he tell you about school and career? Since he was the first one to go to UVA, he was the first one to go to UVA Law. Mm-hmm. What was it that he was telling you about going into that field? What motivated him, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure I know the answer, but I do know that because of my parents, my mother was heavily committed to community service. And my father had a wonderful heart and cared about people. And I think that being a lawyer gives you an opportunity to further those goals.
What were some of the things that your mother did in the community?
She was active in Hadassah, which was a Jewish women's organization. She was active in PTA. She was active in the synagogue. She was active in a number of other organizations. While she was a stay-at-home mom, but she participated in community activities, particularly in a Jewish context.
Did you also participate in any of those kinds of community activities growing up?
Yes. And I was active in high school. was in the Kiwanis or Key Club. I was served on the executive board of the student council, a number of other activities, but we were always busy.
Busy in terms of organizations?
And academics,
Okay.
because we both did well. I was National Honor Society, and we both did well, and we were, and our job was to do well, and that was encouraged by my parents.
Did you have a private reading life? Were there books that you enjoyed reading?
I didn't do a lot of reading. Mm-hmm. I do now, and I did once I got out of high school, but I didn't read a lot.
Mm-hmm. What did you all do for entertainment?
Go to a lot of sports events,
Mm-hmm.
watch some television,
Mm-hmm.
and in those days there might have been 3 channels. We have a very close family, and there'd be a lot of family get-togethers. And my mother was pretty much the key member of the extended family. And we would have a lot of family activities, a lot of parties over the house, particularly during the Jewish holidays. Mm-hmm. And so I think my mother was the center of our extended family.
So tell me about your experiences at UVA Law School. Were there any particular types of courses that you enjoyed or despised while you were in law school?
I'll be honest with you, I wasn't wild about law school.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, again, not having any money, I wanted to come back to Newport News and make money. And most of the classes were so abstract that it really wasn't meaningful. The most meaningful part of law school was that I worked for a law firm in Charlottesville. I did a lot of title work, but it was in those days it was Battle, Neal, Harris, Minor, and Williams. The Battle was former Governor John Battle, that later became McGuire Woods and Battle, and they had an office in Charlottesville because that's where they started. And I was able to sit down and talk with Governor Battle. One of the other partners was Bill Battle, who ran for governor, and I did some political work for him, did some research for him. I helped one of the partners write a chapter on equitable distribution when it first came out. No, I'm sorry, not equitable distribution. I'll have to think about it, but it was a new concept in legal ownership. And so I helped on that.
Was this during your third year of law school?
Yes.
Okay.
But I enjoyed a lot of the professors, and they were some very special, terribly bright people. And I enjoyed the friendship of a lot of my fellow students. But I never really saw that I was wrong, because my perspective was limited, I think. But I wanted them to teach me how to make a living, and I'm still waiting for that one. But so much of it was abstract. Law schools do a much better job today in hands-on experience. They have clinics, they get into the real world. And I remember one class in property, I think they went on for almost a semester, about if one person shoots a deer but doesn't kill it, and somebody finds the dead deer later, who owns it? Well, I'm still waiting for that case to come up, and I think I'll have it nailed if it ever does, but I haven't seen it yet.
And do you remember any of the professors there who really inspired you? Or?
Yeah, there were a number of them. Hardy Dillard, who was dean of the law school, who ultimately went to the World Court in Switzerland. Emerson Spees, who was the Dean of Admissions, and also taught Money Boyd, who was blind and taught procedure. Walter Wadlington, who taught domestic relations. There are a number of them. In those days, it was still a very prestigious law school. I think it's better now, but there were some wonderful professors who were so interesting and engaging that it was the experience was positive.
And so at the end of your 3 years, were you all set to return back to Newport News and hang your shingle out? Or what were your plans?
I was in the National Guard, active duty, for about 4 or 5 months in El Paso, Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas. And then I came back to Newport News and got a job with Alan Diamondstein, who was a delegate in the House of Delegates in Virginia. And I worked for him for 3 or 4 years, I think. Then I went out on my own.
How were you able to secure that position?
Well, I knew him for a long time, and I was involved in politics with him.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew each other for a long time, and he needed somebody, and I needed a job, so we did it.
When you said you knew him a long time, you talking about while you were living here in Newport News? Okay.
Yeah, and he ran, I think he first ran in 1965 and lost, and then in 67 he got elected and stayed in the legislature for, I think, 30 plus years, then retired.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in my investiture for the Court of Appeals, I said that Alan had given me my first job and my last job because he was instrumental in getting me on the Court of Appeals.
Oh. What was that like to work with him and work on his campaign? What were some of your experiences?
Well, in terms of his campaign, I was just a low-level volunteer, but it was fun. We would, I remember one time that we rented a truck, and Alan was on the truck with a bunch of, people screaming and shouting, and we would work the polls. We would do whatever was necessary, and my brother was much more active in his campaign, was an advisor, and Joe stayed in politics until today, because he's still behind the scenes advises various candidates or office holders.
What made you then decide to go into private practice?
I needed to decide what cases I wanted and how I wanted to handle the cases. So I had an office on Mercury Boulevard, and I think that lasted a few years, and then my brother and I went together and we practiced law until I went on the bench in 1986.
When you were a practicing attorney, what was your specialty?
I did a lot of real estate, did a lot of criminal, and I did a lot of domestic relations. And I got appointed as Commissioner in Chancery at Newport News Circuit Court. And a Commissioner in Chancery, upon designation or reference by the Circuit Court, will hear various types of cases. And then here's the evidence, make some recommendations to the court as to how the case ought to be resolved. And they would give me a lot of the equitable distribution cases because there was really no law. It was a new statute. And I think that was one of the reasons why I got appointed to juvenile court. I have a strong background in domestic relations law.
Was that just something that really interested you?
Yeah.
Did you gravitate towards it for any particular reason?
Well, I'm not sure why. I know that it's a difficult area of law because there's so many emotions going on, and clients sometimes don't make rational decisions, and their decisions are based on emotions rather than what's in their best interest. And I recognize that, and you just simply need, that's where counsel at law as opposed to attorney at law really comes into place, because you need to try to get your clients away from, I'm going to punish them, to what's in my best interest and what's in the children's best interest. I remember when I was in circuit court, we had this custody case coming up, and before we started, I asked the parents, suppose I told you to go outside and pick the first person that's walking down the street and let them decide what's in your child's best interest in terms of custody. And of course they both said, we'd never do that. And I said, well, I'm the same stranger that would be walking down the street. You want me to make that decision, or do you think y'all are in a better position to do it than me? And they settled the case.
What helped you to have that kind of approach with parents?
Compassion, I think, and that again comes from my parents. You know, my main concern, and also based on my juvenile court background, is the kids are of primary importance, and the parents need to understand that. And particularly in juvenile court, we see children abused, abandoned. We see children born with cocaine addiction, and we need to protect our children. And the courts ought to be the last resort, but we're thrust into that position. So I'm concerned about the children, and sometimes the children, when parents are firing at each other, children generally get caught in the crossfire. And I, even in circuit court, when we had to make decisions about custody, I really didn't care about the parents' concerns. I'm concerned about the children, and if the parents' concerns are legitimate, I'll certainly consider it.
Mm-hmm. Were there any individuals who helped you to have perhaps a better or broader understanding of how to deal with these kinds of juvenile issues when you were practicing law as opposed to when you were on the bench?
I can't think of any, but common sense certainly dictates that we need to protect our children.
Mm-hmm.
And that parents don't always do that.
Why do you think that's the case?
Well, sometimes parents have so many different issues, whether it's them being abused themselves, whether it's drugs, alcohol, poverty, inability to function, mental issues. They sometimes, I mean, I think in abstract terms they care.
Mm-hmm.
But when the rubber hits the road, they don't have the ability to make the proper judgments.
When you were practicing law, were there any judges or attorneys who really helped you to grow as an attorney yourself?
Can't think of any offhand. That's not to say there weren't any, but I can't think of any. Mm-hmm. Of course, you know, again, it goes back to my background and what my parents instilled in me. That's still the bottom line, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were practicing in private law from 1968 to 1986.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw a lot of changes in society during that time period. Did that impact at all your law practice?
Well, you know, one of the big changes is there was a presumption that the woman was the fit parent or was the proper custodian unless she was unfit. And that pretty well kept the fathers out of the picture. And we know, particularly today, that some fathers are a whole lot better able to raise children than their wives. But it was an uphill battle. And I think to some extent that's the perception today. It's just not the case. When I first started practicing law, there was no support for men. Even though some men were in necessitous circumstance because of injury or illness, and the wives had the ability to support them, couldn't get spousal support. Equitable distribution was a big change in the law. Prior to that, generally the husband owned everything, which meant that the wife couldn't get any of the assets. She could get spousal support or alimony, but couldn't touch the assets. And men typically would have the house, pensions, savings, all in his name. And with equitable distribution coming in, the ownership is not relevant anymore. And it's a fairly sophisticated area of law, but the bottom line is that each party is entitled to a share of property acquired during the marriage. That leveled the playing field. And it took a lot of leverage away from husbands.
So it sounds like that was something that you were very interested in law school and continued to be a part of, obviously, in your practice. And did you find that to be an issue once you got on the bench?
No, not to me. You have to follow the law. And the law now is a whole lot fairer than when I first started. And, but as indicated earlier, it's not what I think. It's what the law is. And my personal views aren't relevant.
Was that something you had to really learn through practice as an attorney, or did you already have a strong sense of that earlier?
I had a strong sense of that. You have to be objective, and you can't let your personal views, even in the practice of law, a client might have done something that I didn't approve of, but it wasn't my role to pass judgment. My role was to assist them.
Not everyone has that perspective. Where did you get that perspective, or is that something you've always felt?
I've always thought that, and those that don't have that perspective are wrong.
Now let me ask you, shifting for just a second, let me ask you a little bit about your personal life. You're married, so tell me.
For 48 years.
Yes, so tell me a little bit about how you met your wife. Tell me her name, when and where she was born, and how the two of you met.
All right. Her name is Leslie. Maiden name is DeYong, D-E-Y-O-N-G, Frank, obviously. She was born in California when her father was stationed there right after World War II. She was born in 1945. Her parents were, her father was born in London and still has family there. He was sent to America by his parents during the Blitz. He came home one day, saw some luggage in the hallway, and he said, "Who's that for?" And his mother said, "You need to leave England, and we're sending you to America." So he was, as a young man, I think he was 17 or 18, he came to Newport News because he had an uncle here. Then he got drafted, and after the war, they came back here. They were married, my in-laws were married, I think in North Carolina, and then came back here to Newport News. And we were members of the same synagogue. So I knew Leslie for a long time. And interestingly, she invited me out for the first date. So, and I'm glad she did.
How old were you all at the time?
Probably 18 or 19. Excuse me. We were married in August of 1966. So I was 22 and she was 20.
So you had just finished college at that time, or you were
No, I
in
had
law
finished,
school?
I think I was in my first year of law school.
Now, was she in college? Did she go to college?
She was at Christopher Newport locally.
And so how did that work, that you were in law school and she was down in this
Yeah,
area?
she would come up and visit.
Okay.
She would get on the train and come up, and we got married between my first and second year of law school. Interesting story. She invited me to this dance, and I didn't want to go. My mother was still in mourning. My father died a little less than a year before, and she said, "If you go to the dance," it was a dance for the Jewish community. She said, "If you go with her, I'll go and get out of the house." And she said, "After all, you don't have to marry her." But fortunately, I didn't listen to her on that regard. So that's when we first went out. And we got married in August of 1966. We have 3 children. My oldest is 41. My middle son was born in 1979, so that'll make him, 1977, so that'll make him 38 in March. And my youngest, Jeremy, was born in April of 1979. And we've been very fortunate, they're good kids.
So now the oldest son's name is?
William.
And the middle?
Well, my oldest is a daughter,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hillary.
Hillary.
My middle son is Will, and my youngest son is Jeremy. Jeremy works for Apple in D.C., Pentagon Mall. My middle son, Will, works for the Commonwealth Department of Behavioral Science. He's their legislative director. And my daughter, Hillary, works for an insurance company in Newport News. We have one grandson, Charlie, who's a year and a half.
And so which child is Charlie?
Will's
Okay.
son.
And
So-
are all 3 of your children married?
No, the only one that's married is Will.
Okay. And one lives in D.C.
Yeah, and Will lives in Short Pump in Richmond, and Hillary lives in Newport News.
Okay.
So we are up in Short Pump on a regular basis.
I'm sure that's the first grandchild.
Yep.
Yes. So tell me about your relationship with your wife. What was she very interested in you continuing in private practice, or?
Well, when I had an opportunity to go in juvenile court, she was ecstatic, as was I, because while juvenile court is very difficult, I think it's better. Being a judge is better than being a lawyer.
Explain why.
I think you have more control over what's going on, and if you do your work properly, there's a whole lot more rewards. There aren't any financial considerations. You don't have to worry about payroll. You don't have to worry about putting up with difficult clients. Plus, you can do a whole lot better for the individuals and for the community.
Why is that?
Because you can make a difference. You can help people if they have problems. You can order them into counseling, rehab. You can have remove children out of their homes if they've been abused and find some suitable accommodations for them. You can terminate parental rights if there's no realistic expectation the parents will turn around. You can affect people's lives in a very positive way.
So 1986 for you was a game changer, and tell me how that happened, how you moved from private practice to juvenile court.
The judge whose position I took died suddenly in office. And I had practiced a lot in juvenile court, and I was comfortable with it, and I thought it would be a good opportunity, and I got the support of the bar. And since the legislature was not in session, for district court judges, the circuit judges fill the vacancy until the next session of the legislature. Well, I knew the circuit judges, and they knew me well. And the only question that they asked me was, if we appoint you, will the legislature appoint you in the next session? I said, I'm satisfied they will. And I talked to Alan Diamonstein, and he assured me that that wouldn't be a problem. So come January or February, I was appointed by the General Assembly for a 6-year term. And I didn't fill that term because there was a vacancy. No, it wasn't a vacancy. They added another judge to the circuit, another position in the circuit bench. And again, I got the support of the Newport News Bar Association, and I got the support of our legislators.
So let's go back for just a second and talk about your experiences on juvenile court. Do you remember your first day or the first maybe few weeks being on the court?
No. But, you know, I've been on 3 courts, and I still think that the juvenile court is the most difficult because the consequences are extreme. You make bad decisions and somebody gets hurt. But you can, as I said, you can do a lot of good, and you're in a position where you can change people's lives. But it's difficult. You know, the disposition in juvenile court is the most important thing. Whether they're guilty or not, whether the child is abused, that's pretty straightforward. But once you make that determination, what do you do next? That's difficult. Depends what resources there are. In this Commonwealth, there are good days and there are bad days in terms of financing, whether there's money to put a child in a rehabilitative, therapeutic environment. That money comes and goes. What's available for the parent to get help for a drug substance problem or mental health problem, whether you can reunite the family, but there are a lot of possibilities. So to craft, and of course you have help. The judge doesn't do it alone. You have a probation staff, you have social services, and it's a collective effort. I always said that the juvenile judge is the conductor of the orchestra because there's so many people that have input, but the bottom line is it's got to be the judge's decision, and you do the best you can.
Were there any judges who helped you or gave you good advice when you were on juvenile court?
Well, my colleague basically said, just do the right thing. Do what your heart tells you to do.
Who was your colleague?
His name was Robert Yacobi, Y-A-C-O-B-I.
And were there any other judges on the
It's
juvenile
just the
court?
two of us. Then they added another judge later. But it was Yacobi and I for a number of years. I was on the juvenile bench 5 years before I went to circuit court.
Now, was there, well, you said there was an opportunity because they added another position.
Mm-hmm.
Was this of interest to you to expand your experiences, or was someone encouraging you to?
I think both.
Okay.
I think a lot of lawyers encouraged me to do it. I took pride, still do, in the fact that I'm prepared. In circuit court, I would review the file. I would do some research prior to the hearing. Sometimes I was more prepared than the lawyers. And that has helped me all through my career, because the lawyers know that I know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I expect the same quality of the lawyers that I do of myself.
Mm-hmm. Were there any cases that were particularly difficult when you were on juvenile or circuit court?
I think they're all, I can't think of specific cases, but I think that they're all difficult because the outcome is so important. Whether or not you return a child to the parents. I remember one case where the mother had abused the child and took the child away from the mother, put it in foster care, and upon review some months later, social services recommended that we return the child to the mother, which I did. And about 2 months later, the mother was brought in on a felony charge because she tried to scald the child. And while I had the recommendation of social services, it still bothers me today that I put that child in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. Although you knew that there was no way to predict something like that.
No, you couldn't. And social services worked with this woman, and they knew her a whole lot more than I did, but nevertheless, I'm the one that made the decision and put the child in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're impacted by those kinds of situations.
Yeah.
When you went to circuit court, tell me a little bit about whether there were changes in the way that you looked at your cases, dealt with the attorneys, was there any difference?
A lot of difference.
So explain that.
Number one, it's a court of record, so everything that's said is recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be a little more careful mm-hmm. in what you say. The other thing is that you have to be more prepared in terms of the specific cases. With a jury, you have to be comfortable with the instructions. And I used to require that in a civil case they file the instructions ahead of time so that I could review them to be sure that they were correct and that all the elements of the action was included in the instructions. I was the first judge to have a computer on the bench. I know in Tidewater.
Uh-huh.
And what I would be able to do is if they're arguing a case, I'd bring the case up on the screen to see whether they were correctly citing the case, what the facts were, and I understand that intimidated a lot of the lawyers.
Now, how did you become the first judge to have the computer? You
I
were
just
just
was.
randomly selected?
And you have to understand that I am computer pretty much illiterate. But I had the computer. I knew how to find the cases. But you know, everything that I did was to be prepared. When I was appointed to circuit court, I took a month off from juvenile court and spent every waking moment getting ready for circuit court.
What were some of the things that you did?
I reread the rules. I reread their manuals about how to conduct jury trials, how to accept pleas, and what goes in the colloquy between the court and the defendant. A lot of that stuff was out there, but I wanted to be sure that I covered all bases. I read the rules of evidence again. I read everything I could get my hands on. And so when I went on the circuit bench, I think that I hit the road running because I had all that preparation.
Were the hours that you had to work different between juvenile and circuit court?
Sometimes yes and sometimes no. We started hearings at 8:30 in the morning and started our docket, civil or criminal, at 10. Other judges in the circuit court had hearings at 9 and 9:30, so they had 2 hearings a morning, 5 days a week. And knowing from practicing law, I knew that people weren't getting into court timely enough, particularly when you're dealing with support. You can go awfully hungry in a couple of months. So what I did is I would set maybe 5 or 6 cases between 8:30 and 10, knowing that most of them would go off anyhow. They'd get settled, they'd be continued or whatever. So during the course of a week, I could knock off a bunch of cases because people need to get into court to have at least in the support area, to get into court and get some relief.
Now, if you're preparing then for all these cases, what kind of how many hours of prep time did that take for you a day?
Well, in the morning, there wasn't a lot of preparation for child support cases or custody cases. That's basically factual based, and I didn't need to prepare for those. But if it was some complicated motion, I would do the research, and frequently they get settled. And so I did the research, I wouldn't say for nothing, because the more you learn, the better off you are. So that never troubled me. And then we would also, during our civil term, we would set 3 or 4 juries deep on any given day. And most of them got settled. Virginia tries very few jury trials during the course of a year, whether it's Newport News or Lynchburg or whatever. Juries aren't that common anymore.
Why is that?
Money. Costs an awful lot of money to try a jury. You have expert witnesses who charge a bundle. Doctors, engineers, and the more complicated the case, the more experts you need. And so cases get settled. There's also mediation has had a big impact on litigation. The Supreme Court has retired judges as settlement judges who have a big impact on that. So there are alternative ways to resolve disputes, and of course, to me, that's the best way to do it.
And so your tenure as a circuit court judge was filled with kind of an expanded view of the whole court system because it was a court of record.
Yeah.
What happened? Because of course you had another opportunity come along. Was this something you sought, or was it sort of placed in your lap?
No, I sought it.
So explain.
And the first time I was interested, I didn't get it. The second time I did.
Okay.
And the dynamics, I've always said if a judge thinks that they're a judge because they're the best and the brightest, they're hallucinating. You have to be competent, but you have to have the political contacts to be a judge.
Is that because you have to be supported by certain delegates who then
They're key
support?
delegates that, there's a lot of power in the legislature is fairly narrow. And a lot of certain legislators call most of the shots.
Okay. And so your friend was one of those legislators?
I think so. But when I was appointed to the Court of Appeals, the House was Democratic and the Senate was Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that dynamics helped as well.
In what way? Explain.
Because I had some support, Republican support in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, quite frankly, I think I did a good job on circuit court. And, but that wasn't, the real reason is I had the political support.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been there 15 years, and it's been a wonderful ride.
So tell me about your first year's experience on the Court of Appeals. You did a lot of preparation for the circuit court. So did you have a similar type of need for preparation for the Court of Appeals?
Well, the way that it works is that we get the briefs and the appendix normally about 6 weeks before we have a panel. We sit in 3-judge panels generally. So, and we have law clerks. So what we do is we review the briefs, we review the appendices, we do independent research, and so we're prepared before the hearing. And we have a very active court, so the lawyer will get up, and before he or she can do much other than introduce themselves, we start asking questions. And sometimes they're prepared and sometimes they're less prepared. There are really good appellate lawyers, and there are some lawyers that aren't particularly comfortable. But in terms of, so that's the preparation there is built in. The Court of Appeals, as a trial judge, I'm making rulings on fact. I'm determining credibility, who's telling the truth, who isn't. Court of Appeals, we really don't get in to credibility. We basically deal with legal issues. Our standard of review, which is the lenses through which we determine the cases, is we're not the fact finders. A trial judge's factual determination, we're bound by unless there's no evidence to support it. So we really don't get into who said this and who said that and who's lying and who's telling the truth. That's the role of the trial judge. I've often told people we don't try defendants on the appellate courts, we try the judges, because we're determining whether or not there's error in the record.
When you went to the Court of Appeals, well, let me back up for a second. Were you ever reversed as a trial judge?
A couple times.
And did you disagree with the reversal?
Big time.
What was happening?
Well, one case that my own court, well, I wasn't on the Court of Appeals then, had to do with this guy was getting ready to pay for his meal at a restaurant, and he had a $20 bill in his hand. This guy came up to him, grabbed the $20 bill, and ran. He was charged with robbery, and I reduced it to larceny from the person, because there was no threat or force. That's what robbery is. And the Court of Appeals reversed me, saying that it's not a lesser included offense, so I had to find him not guilty. Well, to this day, they're wrong. But, you know, we're all entitled to be wrong.
And so you when you got on the court, now you didn't have, or did you have a clerk assisting you when you were?
I did.
Okay. How did you choose your clerks?
My bottom line, when I interview them, I've already screened the applications, and I know that they're competent and I know they're bright. So the only thing left for me to do is to determine whether our personalities mesh and whether or not I will enjoy having them in my chambers. I don't get them to do writing samples. I don't get them to do any of the academic exercises. I just want to know whether we can get along. And I've never made a mistake.
What are some of the things that you look for in a clerk?
Well, I want them to be bright, but I want them to be personable. I want them to be friendly. We really have, all of my clerks are friends.
Are there any who've stayed with you for more than, say, a year or two?
Yeah, I have two clerks now who are leaving, unfortunately. One has been with me for 10 years, and one has been with me for 6 years. I've never, most judges will turn the clerks over either once a year or every 2 years. And I've never believed in that because, number one, the first 6 months, they're trying to figure out what their job is. In the last 6 months, they're looking for another job. So once I get a good one, and again, I've never made a mistake, I want them to stay as long as they can.
Who are some of the other judges on the Court of Appeals that you've worked with? And have any of them really been of tremendous assistance to you?
Well, I'm not sure I want to get into that because they're all of them have had influence on me. One is a senior judge, been retired for a while, Sam Coleman, who has been a mentor. He's a gentleman. He is well-read. He can moderate potentially explosive situations. You know, all of us have egos, and sometimes we lose sight of what our real job is, and Sam has a very calming influence on us. But he's a hard worker, and he's dedicated to the court, and he's a gentleman, and I've always respected him and tried to follow his lead.
And what about the regular work day being on the Court of Appeals? Describe a typical day.
All right, when I get here, the first thing I do is review other judges' opinions because I don't want them on my desk. I want them out because they're waiting to have responses from the whole court. Anytime that a judge writes a published opinion, they send it first to the panel for comments, and then after that's done, they send it to the full court for comments. So I want to get my comments out quickly so they don't have to wait for me to release their opinion. there's a lot of, aside from the cases that we're writing or working on other judges' cases for the panel, there are a number of other things. In criminal cases, it's not an appeal of right. You file a petition for appeal, and we determine whether there's any merit for it to go to a merit panel. I like to get all that stuff done first. And then once that's done, then we go over and work on our cases. And of course, I have two highly qualified law clerks, and I have an administrative assistant who's been with me for over 30 years. And sadly, we're parting next week. So I have a wonderful team. I couldn't do it without them. And so after all of these other things are done, then we work on our cases. And we'll sit down and discuss them, determine which way we should go. And every time I hire a law clerk, I say, I'm not hiring you to be a yes man. I don't need that. I need a critical review. And if we disagree, we disagree. But I need that, and it's important.
So when you're writing your opinions or comments on other judges' opinions, do you do that on computer? Do you do it longhand?
Longhand.
You prefer that way?
I do. I'm from the old school. When I cut and paste, I use Scotch tape and scissors.
Literally.
Literally. Which has got to stop, because when I become a senior judge, I have no clerical help, and the law clerks are in the staff attorney's office in Richmond. So I need to change my entire procedure. And I'm getting way too old to do that, but I have to.
So I assume, though, that you do know how to type.
I do.
But you simply prefer to have your hand.
It's just like when all the cases come in, they come in on the computer, and we print them. Because I still like to use a yellow marker and highlight and make notes in the margin.
And so this sounds like it comes from your college days.
It does. It does. I'm just slow on technology.
And yet you were the first judge to have a computer.
Yeah.
There has to be some irony in all of that.
I think it's substantial irony. Because I probably peaked at that stage.
Now, I read that you've participated in a lot of educational sessions for lawyers and for other judges.
And judges, yeah.
And I was struck by, I guess, this philosophy of be prepared, be accurate, be brief, be clear. And it seemed as if that was definitely your viewpoint. And I was wondering when you acquired that viewpoint. Were there instructors or other judges who helped you to see that?
When I went on the juvenile court bench and on the circuit bench and on the Court of Appeals, I never want a lawyer to say, he's over his head. I'm not, but I never wanted it. And the way that you do that is to be prepared and to understand the issues. So that's what I've done for my whole judicial career. And I expect the same of the lawyers. And that's why I have, in fact, Judge Humphreys, who is a colleague on the court, he and I have done a number of programs, not only for judges. Our program is called How Not to Get Reversed, but also to tell lawyers about the appellate practice, to tell judges about our standard of review. You know, like I said earlier, if it's a factual determination, we give great deference. to the trial court. If the decision is a matter of discretion, we give great deference to the trial court. If it's a legal issue, we don't give any deference to the trial court. We determine that issue de novo or anew. So we tell the judges, make the factual findings. If you can hang your hat on factual findings, you're pretty much bulletproof. If you have to make your decision based on the law, we review that de novo. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but a judge somebody might file a motion to ask for some relief, and if the judge says, I'm sorry, the law doesn't authorize me to do that, then the standard of review is de novo as to whether or not the law does allow it. If the trial court said, I understand what you're asking me, but I'm not going to do it, then the standard of review on appeal is abuse of discretion. So depending on your answer really kicks in what lens we look through to determine if there's error.
What would you say is perhaps the most difficult case that you've had to examine while you've been on the Court of Appeals?
Well, there was an administrative appeal about environmental issues, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation brought suit about some lake over on the south side. And intellectually it was difficult, but I didn't like my decision. I didn't want to go there, but I was compelled to do it because that's what the law. So it was difficult in the sense that I was making law that I didn't like, but that wasn't my privilege. My privilege was to go where the law was, and additionally it was a substantial case because it had to do with representational standing. Could the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, on behalf of other constituents, so to speak, get involved in that administrative law process? And I ruled that they could. I was hoping that the Supreme Court would reverse me, first time in my career. And the appeal was dismissed because of procedural defects. That's the law. And I followed the law, although I didn't like the result.
Were there any other cases that you recall that were perhaps not equally difficult, but difficult for you?
Well, as an example, in termination case, termination of parental rights, in the juvenile court or circuit court, those are tough cases to say to a parent that you'll never have any more rights for the child based on abuse and whatever. In the Court of Appeals, we don't get involved in that. On appeal, we determine whether there's any legal error. So it takes the emotion out, although I still don't like when parents lose their parental privilege, but sometimes it's necessary to let the child move on and not have to live in that environment that has been so harsh. So they're not tough cases, but at least the emotion is out of that. We don't sit, the defendants aren't in court, the parties aren't in court. We simply determine based on a cold record.
You're about to retire now. How do you want to be remembered?
I want to be remembered as being competent, as being fair, but I also want to be remembered as one who has had a positive influence on the judges of the court. I have a wonderful relationship with everybody, and excuse me, and I think that I have a calming influence on the court. And I think that's important.
And
Excuse me.
my final question is, do you feel as if there are any opportunities that you would still like to pursue, or that you may have missed over the course of your career?
I don't think so. I am delighted with my life. I'm delighted with what I brought to the judiciary and what the judiciary has given me. And I have no regrets in terms of retirement. I wish I could have stayed longer, but I can't. Mm-hmm. I will continue to serve the court as a senior judge, which means that we have a reduced caseload, but we still are involved with the court. And that's pretty much it.
And what would you like future judges to know as they begin to deliberate on these various issues that are put before them, these different cases?
Simply to follow the law, that they should have no agenda. They should not be pro-prosecution or pro-defendant. They ought not be pro-insurance company or pro-claimant. And call them like you see them, based on the law. And if they do that, they'll be great judges. And also do your do your homework.
Well, thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. This has been fun.
Thank you.
And it gave me an opportunity to reflect.
Thank you.